Our vision is for a Scotland where everyone is treated equally. Here are 5 ways we're helping to build a fairer Scotland. 1. We're committed to developing an effective anti-racist strategy. We have started work on a comprehensive review, which will inform a new strategy from 2023 onwards. 2. This year we'll make £10,000 available to support organisations to kickstart or continue their work to tackle inequalities and create a fairer world. 3. There will be a public consultation into how Scotland's role in empire and slavery can be best acknowledged in our museums and other history education. 4. Coronavirus disproportionately affects minority ethnic groups, so we set up an expert group to help inform our policies. We're implementing their recommendations to make sure minority ethnic communities get the support they need. 5. Schools have been given new anti-racist resources that reflect diversity in culture, identities and experiences, and the value they bring to Scotland.
So I stumbled across this little video here from the 6th of January 2022 on the Scottish Government's YouTube channel, just purely by chance. It's been a while since I've actually gone searching for this shit, so it kind of fell into my lap. Eradicating racism, inequality and injustice across society. Almost convinced that I've seen this video before, as if they've just re-uploaded it, but nonetheless, the fact that they've re-uploaded it in and of itself showcases that they want this to be centre stage for the news. Doesn't really elaborate too much, obviously, only a minute and 20 seconds roughly in length, but you know, the description here. The Race Equality Action Plan sets out the key actions for the government to drive positive change for minority ethnic communities. A Fairer Scotland for All Race Equality Action Plan highlight report for 2017 to 2021. I went through this years ago. I don't know if I actually made a video on it at the time, but I did read through it many years ago. Maybe 2018, 2019. Just this usual shit that you would expect. Predict even. Not entirely sure if I'll go through some of it in this video here, but it's just just briefly talking about this nonsense for a second, if I may. There's no real elaboration in regards to the first point where they say that they're going to be implementing some strategy going forward to eradicate racism, and they talk about the fact that the strategy will be created to go from 2023 onwards, so presumably it will be an up-to-date variation of this shit here. But as I say, not really that much elaboration. Therefore, there's not really much I can add to it because I would just be speculating. But then it goes on to say here that they will be adding making 10 grand available to support organisations to kickstart or continue the work to tackle inequality and create a fair world. Now, of course, even that in and of itself, not that I care too much about what they intend to do with 10 fucking grand, despite the fact it's our money. Plenty of other things they could spend that little bit of 10 grand on, that sort of shit. Bottom of priority list, unless you're from the SNP, of course, then it's top of the priority list. But, this talk of inequality, I've been through it 1,000 times before. I'm not going to beat around the bush or bore people with repeating myself. But tackling inequality, what inequality? Disparities, of course. Things ain't equal on paper. So we're talking about equity, but it's dressed up neat and nice and namby-pamby, wishy-washy, rainbow sprinkled dust, of course, to imply that we need to achieve equality. Inequality is rife. It's not rife, it's disparities. Disparities that exist because we live in a society that's predominantly white. Therefore, it stands to reason that the vast majority of positions and whatever it may be will be white. And a fairer world. Now, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean equal on paper. The same way that you could apply the same metric to the parliament where it has to be 50-50 men and women, and because it's not 50-50 men and women, therefore it indicates gender inequality. Same thing is applicable here. Then it goes on to say this. I actually never read through this before, believe it or not. But they say here, there will be a public consultation into how Scotland's role... I'm sorry, it's point 4 I haven't read through. A public consultation into how Scotland's role in empire and slavery can be best acknowledged in our museums. And why are they doing this, of course? Because the Social Justice Commission that was set up suggested that this was put into effect. And who's part of the Social Justice Commission? Well, it's everybody's favourite grey anti-white cowboy and a plethora of other dickheads. You know, this is one of the things that they want implemented. They want to have museums showcasing the bad sides to our history. They want our education to include it all as well. And until such a time as we are not ignorant of our past, racism will still be rife, and the microaggressions will still pester Graham Anti-White Campbell. The education system, just fucking
education.
But this bit here, they want to talk about number 4. Where is it? Coronavirus disproportionately affects minority ethnic groups. Now, of course, there's a multitude of reasons as to why that might be the case. Why it is the case in some instances. Standards of living, personal choices, etc., etc. A vitamin deficiency is another one. As I've said before in previous videos, I believe it was actually Sargon on his lotus eater sting ages ago. They showed some BBC documentary where it's kind of debunked all the shit that the BAMEs were trying to imply when they were looking at the disparities in relation to COVID and deaths for the BAMEs, etc. Because obviously they're trying to imply it's racism, systemic racism, and all the rest of it. Graham Campbell is actually on record as saying that the pandemic of racism is responsible for the deaths for the BAMEs. Yeah, I've got that video on my channel, believe it or not. But this documentary essentially completely exposed that shit for what it was, shit. Not that you needed the BBC to tell you that it was shit, but the fact that even the BBC are calling it shit really doesn't hold your argument up in high regard. But nonetheless, so the COOF disproportionately affects minority ethnic groups, so the automatic assumption must be that there's some sort of rife inequality that needs rectified in order to stop this. And they say here that they set up an expert group to help inform our policies. Yeah. We're implementing their recommendations. Yes, they are. So I was just looking through this. I genuinely hadn't seen it before. Now, who's on this little panel of people? Well, some familiar faces, or names even. Dr. Emma Jackson, the BAME from the Feminist Advisory Council, who I've made a video on in the past. We've got somebody I don't really know. Christina McKelvey, of course, the feminist arsehole. We've got Paul Johnson, Director General for Education, Communities and Justice. Douglas Anderson, Raj Bupal. Jatin Haria, Aisha, Holloway, whatever. Nazar Mir, Dr. Gina Nito, Rami Otso. Okay. We have Aziz Shiki, whatever. But it says here that the group, which will consist of academics and other advisors alongside government officials, will work to contribute to the government's emerging approach and advise and propose actions to mitigate the harms felt by BAMEs in relation to the COOF. The group will feed into the work of the Race Equality Action Plan Programme Board, as well as make strong links with the COVID Advisory Group and other key groups as necessary. But I was reading through this shit, and I mean, some of the garbage that is written in here really does showcase, yet again, that the people that proclaim that they're trying to eradicate disparities and the racism and whatnot, they're all buying into the critical race theory nonsense. They're all buying into the anti-racist jargon, rhetoric, ideology, beliefs. This isn't about rectifying genuine inequalities. This is about pushing their fucking agenda. Go figure. So it says here that the expert reference group on the COOF and ethnicity, initial advice and recommendations on systemic issues. Introduction. So the reference group was established by the government, of course, and as I've said before in previous videos, every single time the government, the SNP in particular obviously, create an advisory group or an expert group with the purpose of creating recommendations for the government to consider, they accept each and every single one of the recommendations, irrespective of which group we're talking about, whether it's the climate change twats, whether it's the feminists, whether it's the LGBT, or whether it's this lot. Every single recommendation gets implemented and accepted. Why? Because they're all working from the same hymn sheets. Literally. There's no difference between Nicola Thinlips, the bull-cut big brain, John Swinney, and Douglas, what's his name? I can't remember the guy's name. Oh yeah, Angus Robertson, sorry. No difference between them and Graham Campbell and all the other anti-racist grifters. Anyhow, to ensure that we have an accurate understanding of the impact of the coup on minority, ethnic and migrant communities in Scotland, and that our policy and responses reflect this, there is a need to work on improving existing systems and processes and analysing what we know, while at the same time looking more fundamentally at how the system itself needs to change. Good old-fashioned system change, of course. Of course. So, I'm not going to prattle on too much about the little introduction. The government recognises the fundamental relationship of systemic issues to inequalities. Of course it does. The coup has exposed and highlighted the deep-rooted health and socio-economic inequalities that minority ethnic communities face. Are we going to define minority ethnic communities in this respect? Are we talking about Polish people? Are we talking about English? Are we talking about German? Or are we talking about Pakistanis and Indians and Africans? And the system failures to address these issues. The government recognises that we have an opportunity to make fundamental and lasting changes to address these inequalities. Disparities, of course. But it's inequalities. This subgroup was specifically asked to consider the following. Given the potential for a resurgence of the coup, what priority action should be taken to mitigate COVID-19 risk for minority ethnic patients, health staff and communities in the short term? What steps should be taken to address the health inequalities and systemic issues exposed via the coup facing minority ethnic people and communities? To what extent does learning from issues around the coup and race require the government to adjust its approach to tackling race equality as set out in the Race Equality Action Plan? What is the group's advice in the most pressing areas for action? This paper sets out an overview of the group's approach to these questions, prior to setting out the context and recommendations. We acknowledge the existence of formal and informal structural, institutional and cultural processes that place minority ethnic and migrant groups at a disadvantage within Scotland in relation to the majority being the ethnic Scots. These structural disadvantages are experienced by groups which are defined by their migrant status, such as asylum seekers, refused asylum seekers, refugees and EU migrants, as well as those which are defined by their ethnicity, such as gypsy travellers, Pakistani, Chinese, Indian, etc. Well, that answers my question in relation to EU migrants. So they're also part of this group that are affected by rife inequalities. Okay. Vulnerabilities to the coup are consistent with an established pattern in which intersections between socio-economic status, ethnicity and racism intensify inequalities in health for ethnic groups. This demands vigilance in how vulnerabilities to COVID by deprivation categories will disproportionately impact minority ethnics in Scotland. While higher proportions of some minority ethnic groups, aka Pakistani, Indian and Chinese, live in less socio-economic disadvantaged circumstances in Scotland compared with the rest of the UK, overall minority ethnic people remain more likely to be in poverty than the majority white Scottish population, and asylum seekers and refugees are vulnerable to destitution. There is plenty of white Scottish people, aka Scottish people. You got this language here, really pisses me off, as people that are familiar with my channel know. White Scottish. I ain't white Scottish, I'm fucking Scottish. But nonetheless, there's plenty of people in Scotland that are impoverished who are Scottish, or white Scottish. Plenty of people that are homeless. Plenty of people that barely make ends meet. Plenty of people struggling. Plenty. These higher levels of deprivation express and underlying profiles of poor health and contributes, but does not fully explain the impact of COVID on minority ethnic groups. Also, the experiences of deprivation may differ amongst minority ethnic groups. This means that some minority ethnic populations will be more susceptible to critical complications if they contract the coup, not because of ethnic and racial categories are themselves a causal factor, but instead they map onto underlying social determinants which generate these pre-existing health conditions. Now, as I said, that documentary, I think it was last year maybe, it must have been last year. One of the things was standards of living, obviously, the way that these people live their life, diets, on average, vitamin deficiency, things such as that played pivotal roles in regards to why some of these people ended up more sick than others. But of course, it's much easier to just suggest, drum roll please, oh, it's racism, systemic barriers. This document notes the recommendations made to the CMO Scotland from the COVID-19 Advisory Group in July 2020 that in the absence of robust Scottish data on COVID-19 risks and outcomes by ethnicity, the government should assume that the impacts of the inequalities being found in England and the UK data also apply in Scotland. The impact of the CUF on minority ethnic people is so significant that the precautionary principles apply, and this paper endorses that view. Okay. Anyway, let's go down here. So, an intersectionality lens highlights how different social characteristics combine so that some groups experience disproportionately poorer outcomes. For example, risks experienced by low-income minority ethnic groups may substantially differ from both high-income ethnic minority and low-income majority populations. The model proposed here will need to be adjusted in the light of new data and evidence. Okay, I don't know what they're talking about, as I said, first time reading this shit. But it goes on to say here, right? Differential exposures to the CUF, institutional and systemic factors. There are intersectional issues that have particular impacts on minority ethnic groups due to poverty, destitution, racism, and discrimination. Now, we could make the case, or they could make the case, and I could get on board with it, that some of them will suffer from destitution and poverty alongside other people who happen to be Scottish, of course. But when they start going down the fucking narrative or the line, the train of thought even, of racism and so-called discrimination, now come on. And even if that was a genuine thing that these people suffer and experience, how the hell does that contribute to whether or not they suffer the more severe aspects of the CUF? It's just fucking nonsense, I'm sorry. Anyhow, we provide some examples of why COVID risks may disproportionately affect minority ethnic groups, but this is not intended to provide a comprehensive explication. Right. Differential exposures. Occupational exposure, e.g. health and care workers, transportation workers, income and housing issues faced by those seeking asylum. Oh no. Living conditions, e.g. overcrowding. Whose fault is that if these people are living in overcrowded accommodation? It's not our fault that Pakistanis on average churn out God knows how many children. And it's certainly not our fault that Eastern European people who still happen to reside here, who work for cheapest chip money, all tend to jump into the one room unless they have a family of their own. Poverty, okay, but again that affects Scottish people as well as BAMEs. Racism and discrimination, fuck off. Lack of understanding of Scotland's ethnic diversity. Oh, a lack of understanding of Scotland's ethnic diversity somehow is listed as one of the many examples or exposures that BAMEs suffer, and as a consequence of suffering from such exposures, makes them more susceptible to the more severe aspects of the CUF. A lack of understanding of Scotland's ethnic diversity. What they really mean, let's break that down quite quickly. Let's redefine that. Let's put it in plain English. What they mean by that is coming to terms with the fact that Scotland is no longer full of ethnic Scots, but is now, in fact, full of many other groups of people, and it will always be that way, and it will continue to be that way, and in time it will get worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. The lack of understanding of Scotland's ethnic diversity. Fuck off, man. Differential vulnerabilities, diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Vitamin D has been hypothesised, but current evidence suggests it does not appear to be an important factor. Well, that's shite, because vitamin D is one of the things that's recommended for people, irrespective of what fucking race you are or ethnicity, to take to help you with the CUF, or to prevent you getting the severe strands off the CUF. But of course, they can't have that. No. So it's just a hypothesis. Different access to treatment and other forms of support. Research shows a greater risk of adverse outcomes even after hospitalisations. Migrants without a formal status will continue to face barriers in accessing NHS services because of understandable concerns about the sharing of patient data between the NHS and the Home Office. And so again, how's that our problem? If they don't want to go to the NHS because they're afraid or concerned that their information might be shared. Not our fucking problem. Anyway, let's see what else they say here. In addition to the important roles played by living conditions, the impact of racism as well as ethnicity needs to be considered as an additional cause of stress and disadvantage only experienced by people who are racialised. See, there's that word, racialised. You know? Again, this is right out of the anti-racist bullshit playbook. All the anti-racist education resources and whatnot are completely riddled with this nonsense. the term racialised, because the assumption is that race doesn't exist. The Scottish Government live by that mantra. The people that publish this shit live by that mantra. Now, whether or not you believe race is a genuine thing or not, that really isn't for me to say at this point, because again, it's one of those things where I don't really give a shit about, because the more that they push the point home that race doesn't exist, the more it brings ethnicity to the surface. And hey, that suits me just fine, because as far as I'm concerned, I am Scottish. I'm not white Scottish. White to me is just an umbrella term, a label, if you will. You know, I'm not saying that race doesn't exist, but the point that these people are trying to make is that race doesn't exist because white people ran around the world or sailed around the world, oppressing everybody, murdering everybody, and created the terminology and the narrative and the ideology and the concept of race in order to deliberately treat everybody else who wasn't like them, aka not white, as subordinates and subhuman. That's what they tried to say. So in order to eradicate racism, we need to eradicate the concept of race, according to these people. Racism is a childhood exposure. Racism is a stressor in its own right because of persistent, unavoidable disempowerment. Childhood exposure to racism, like other adverse childhood experiences, has lifelong effects. Expanded ACEs, including experience of racial discrimination, and are associated with poor outcomes in adulthood. Okay, so even if all that was true, how does that have anything to do with the CUF? It's just fucking nonsense, man. Our understanding needs to rapidly increase and recognise that racism is itself a harmful exposure. Racism's a harmful exposure. Oh, give me strength. Give me strength. And also causes other harmful exposures. It is therefore important in Scotland to pay attention to the long-standing international evidence, in particular from the US, where, well, of course from the US, whereby racism is known to have a profound effect on health and illness, including at a psychological and epigenetic level. So let me get this straight. They're trying to imply somewhat that BAMEs are more susceptible to the severe aspects of the CUF because of racism and the effects that racism plays on them. Oh, fuck's sake. You know, this is the sort of shit you would expect to see in some wacky anti-racist blog or website. But to come from a group created by the government in order to suggest and create recommendations for said government to then in turn consider, that's a fucking problem. Anyway. Minority ethnic communities will be more susceptible to critical complications if they contract the CUF, not because ethnic and racial categories are themselves a causal factor, but because they map onto underlying social determinants which generate these pre-existing health conditions. Now, as I said earlier on, you can make the argument, and you've got a point, when you bring up destitution. Well, I guess they're really more talking about refugees, quote-unquote, there in that respect. But, you know, poverty, impoverished people, doesn't matter what race you're from. Yeah, but I can see that playing a role in terms of whether or not you have a relatively healthy standard of living, therefore, by extension, whether or not you could be more susceptible to the CUF. But when you then try to shoehorn in the other shit, such as racism and discrimination and all that garbage, that to me quite clearly indicates that what we have here is yet another example of these people trying to shoehorn in their ideology through the back door. None of this shit is applicable to racism and whatnots. The lack of high-quality population-based data on ethnicity hampers understanding of ethnic variations in CUF and its outcomes in Scotland. The deep-rooted health and socio-economic inequalities faced by minority ethnic communities have been repeatedly raised by a range of organisations and researchers as a priority areas for action for a number of years. Systemic issues are, by their nature, hard to recognise because they are rooted in our assumptions and everyday practices. Of course! So what needs to change is everything. And I love that. It's so convenient because they claim that it's us, we can't see things, it's our assumptions and whatnot, when the reality of the matter is it's the people that profess this ideology that are seeing the world very differently to everybody else. The government approach to tackling systemic racism must include as a priority a baseline audit of past and current initiatives and their effectiveness, and determine clearly defined measures to tackle systemic racism and the implementation of equality strategies and processes with a clear link made between outcomes, of course, fucking outcome, not opportunity, no. Action taken and impact. It must be acknowledged that many of the recommendations, such as those outlined below, have in some form been made before. What is not known nor understood from these recommendations is what was attempted, what was successful, and if not successful, why not? Until that is understood, there is a risk to all involved in supporting this work generated because of the uniqueness of the pandemic impact on all our lives and the global clarity witnessed through the BLM protests that we are simply recreating a moment of false hope. They actually bring up Black Lives fucking Matter. Of course they do. Wow. We need to better understand the barriers to implementing previous recommendations related to the impact of racism and discrimination on access and service use across the public sector. So, what did I just say about a minute or two ago in regards to them shoehorning in this shit through the back door? And we've just completely veered off topic from what this should be about, which is people living in poverty are more likely to be susceptible to the more severe aspects of the coup. I mean, I just boldly and proudly and nonchalantly talking about the requirement to address barriers relating to the impact of racism and discrimination. And there needs to be clear and demonstrable lines of accountability in relation to the ownership of actions and reporting of impact across the government and clear timelines for action. What's this fucking got to do with the coup? Nothing. But it's just yet another excuse. So was this, in fact, Black Lives Matter shit. Racism and racialization should be acknowledged as important mechanisms which lead to unequal outcomes. Oh, of course, leads to unequal outcomes. Proof, disparities. The disparities, guy. Racism is a cause. Race equality is a desirable outcome. Oh yeah, and what do they mean by equality? Well, it's not equality, is it? Because the minute that you start to interfere to try and achieve what you proclaim as equality, you make things unequal. It's a desirable outcome. Oh yeah. Oh, I love the wording. It's so predictable, so boring. The government and public bodies should recognise that they are a part of a system, and their own actions are therefore likely to include direct and/or indirect discrimination. It is important to improve awareness and understanding of structural racism, institutional racism, and individual racism. An effective way to achieve this is by increasing engagement and participation by people from ethnic minorities. Oh, of course, so we'll just increase the participation of BAMEs because that way we can all talk about the figment of the BAMEs' imaginations. This can't be about people, it must be achieved with people. The objective is to ultimately change the processes, to change structures and practices that discriminate against minority ethnic people and communities. Any intervention that focuses on ethnicity and racialised characteristics is particularly vulnerable to institutional or systemic discrimination of this kind and needs to be considered carefully. I love how, as I said, this has all been accepted in full by the fucking government. The government and public bodies should recognise that they are part of this. Did I read that back? I think I did, the advice and recommendations in this report will be... Oh, maybe I haven't read the recommendations yet, sorry. In this report will be structured to provide immediate CUF actions, shorter term actions that include building an infrastructure within Scotland that focuses on accountability and oversight. And, okay. Recommendation 1, we have emergency sustenance fund payments during the COVID-19, during the coup, BMIS and the black ethnic minorities in Scotland action, emergency sustenance fund payments to ensure that minority ethnic families and individuals were able to access food. However, the delivery of such a service by BMIS is not sustainable, so they want the government to deliver an emergency sustenance fund using existing infrastructure of state support for people and families across Scotland. Okay. Government should ensure that any future CUF response includes the learning and needs identified through the current programme. Recommendation 2, no recourse to public funds. This fund policy discriminates against minority ethnic communities and leaves children and families exceptionally exposed to the CUF and their social impacts. Children are penalised for their parents' nationality and situation. The government and local authorities must ensure that any local lockdowns do not differentially impact on those subject to this discriminatory policy. Accepting the reserved nature of the policy, the government should review the nature of the no recourse to public fund restrictions and determine a localised strategy within those restrictions which can navigate how they can be overcome. Recommendation 3, test to protect and future health measures. I'm not going to fucking bore everybody with that shit. Fair work practices. The joint statement on fair work expectations during the transition out of lockdown and the guidance of workplace risk assessments are welcome. However, studies highlighted earlier in this paper show that discrimination and unfair practices towards the minority ethnic people has taken place. Government, NHS Scotland and other partners must demonstrate how they will ensure that fair work practices are in place in health and social care settings, etc., etc. Investment in minority ethnic organisations and mental health services. In the event of enhanced lockdown, the government will need to invest in NHS Scotland mental health provision. Further, there should be support for minority ethnic-led sector organisations to provide the service required to Scotland's diverse demographics. Why do they need specific organisations for themselves? In addition, the government and NHS Scotland should deploy culturally competent and multilingual psychotherapists and counsellors as there are ethnic inequalities in accessing mental health services. You're in Scotland, therefore there should be nothing of the sort regarding multilingual specialists and whatnot. Learn English. Where am I? Sorry. For example, building on the work already done in Scotland by Bemis, Phoenix, what the fuck ever, Amina Muslim Women Resource Centre, yada yada, and others, and also the internationally recognised community-led partnership model involving statutory organisations, private and third sector to support mental health improvement developed by the Black Thrive London. What? More broadly, the government should commission research to identify barriers and put in place plans to address the unmet need and persistent ethnic inequalities in mental health care. The government must take action to ensure the inclusivity of public health messaging around the COVID minority ethnic communities and migrants. They should take into account language barriers, literacy levels, cultural factors, religious beliefs and differential access to health-related information amongst diverse communities. We endorse the recent sage advice. I love this though, you know. I think they took this a bit too literally now because the adverts that come on the TV, the adverts relating to getting the booster and whatnot, far too many BAMEs for a Scottish advert. Especially that I'm rolling up my sleeve because I'm gay type fucking nonsense. An effective communication strategy should target capability, knowledge and skills, opportunity, societal norms, and physical resources and motivation. Okay, whatever the fuck that means, bro. I don't want this video getting too long, but okay. There is a concern that public communication around the higher proportion of cases of minority ethnic communities could risk creating a blame game that would lead to negative repercussions for these fucking blame game. Nobody in their right mind is looking at Pakistanis and going, well, the Pakistanis are getting COVID more than average. Well, they're probably responsible for it. Nobody's thinking that. I mean, talk absolute shite. Anecdotal evidence. I've got anecdotal evidence. What? They unironically include that. Anecdotal evidence suggests this has already been happening in Scotland for many groups. Well, it's anecdotal, so it might as well not be printed. Including the Chinese community. The Chinese community in Scotland. Well, fuck's sake. The Scottish Government should be clear and resolute in standing up for this danger, especially the potential exploitation of this narrative by racists and the far right. The far fucking right. We can't be having the far right present in Scotland in this far left utopia. No. The narrative exploited by racists. You know, it's just so pathetic. You know, they changed the Indian variant back in the day to the Delta variant. We couldn't call it the China virus, as Donald Trump used to say. They changed the name of what as well? I can't remember. I'm going too far back at this point. But, you know, we couldn't call it that. Despite the fact that the Spanish flu from 100 years ago is still known as the Spanish flu. That's fine though. Anyhow, short-term actions. Accountability. A key recommendation is to establish a more effective accountability and governance infrastructure in Scotland. Too often recommendations have been made on racism and minority ethnic issues that have subsequently been forgotten and not implemented. Oh, dearie me. They may be raised again by other groups without reference to what has been asked before. The absence of institutional memory within the current system and structures is frustrating, disempowering, and can be understood as a mechanism by which systemic discrimination occurs. Great, fantastic, riveting. Again, no, what the fuck's this got to do with COVID? The proposal was that a new infrastructure building on what exists already should embed 4 elements. An observatory which brings together quantitative and qualitative data on ethnic and racial inequalities in Scotland, disparities. This should not only include epidemiological data, but also cultural, historical, and other social, political, and economic factors. A repository which holds historical and current evidence from a range of different sources to maintain awareness and inform actions. Collaboration that reflects the consensus between the government and all of the relevant stakeholders. Who the fuck are these stakeholders? It doesn't matter which subject we're talking about, they're always there. That Scotland needs to better engage with the experiences of those racialised in society. Oh, the pesky racialisation. Co-production processes led by those who are most affected by its outcomes. And it's important that there was an independent external oversight of the work and linked to work that's been taken forward elsewhere in Scotland. And when they talk about this, obviously what they're saying here is we need a bunch of BAMEs, probably like Graham Campbell or something. You can sit on top of the fucking panel. An oversight commission must be put in place consisting of representatives from minority ethnic communities, academia, third sector and other national and international experts. So we got Graham Campbell, of course. Jeff fucking Palmer. Probably have that boot to loot YouTube. There'll be others probably. The Oversight Commission should provide strategic oversight to the progression of the recommendations made by the group and also any future race equality action plans put in place by the government. Oh, fucking hell. Where am I? Shit. The ERG proposes that options for the status, structure, remit, staffing, complement and resourcing of the Oversight Commission needs to be urgently explored, including within the full co-participation of minority ethnic people in communities. This could be a statutory body in a similar vein to the Scottish Human Rights Commission or an independent body funded by the government to complement, enhance and add momentum to the work of the race equality units, third sector parties, etc., etc., etc. Conscious of time at this point. Of course, the Commission would, through a human rights-based approach, ensure that its actions and evidence are informed via the co-participation of minority ethnic people and communities and help establish infrastructure to house the recommendations which embed the 4 elements described in paragraph 36 above. Okay. Functions of the infrastructure should include... Oh, come on, man. There's so much gibberish here. We got... Provide leadership to improve the quality of the government, local authority and other public bodies in their collection, analysis and reporting of data on minority ethnic groups. Report regularly on the impact of policies and racialised inequality in Scotland. Highlight priority areas for investment to boost progress in affected communities across Scotland. As a priority, the government should conduct an inequalities audit across the government and other public bodies, functions. And the government should work with the NHS and local authorities and other public service partners to ensure that data relating to workforce and the use of public services is accurate, comprehensive and accessible, can be ethnically disaggregated and is regularly monitored and reviewed. And in the case of any disparities, it must be rectified. Anti-racist actions, of course. Given the new post-COVID-19 landscape and the highlighting of problems of institutional racism within the existing functions and systems of the state, there needs to be a focus on racism and anti-racism actions within the strategies and plans across the government, local authorities and public bodies. The Race Equality Action Plan is due to be renewed in 2021, and to ensure that a gap is not created as a result of the parliamentary elections next year, planning for the renewal should start as soon as possible with a clear focus that the actions in any revised plan will be explicitly anti-racist with clear actions, outputs and measurable outcomes. Fucking wow. Again, what's this got to do with COVID exactly? It's like they all sat there and went, now how can we shoehorn in some anti-racist bullshit, some of our agendas? And they all just said to themselves, fuck it. We don't need to shoehorn it in, just write it. A measure of racism. The government should explore the development of a workable measure of racism and discrimination and its impacts on physical and mental health. This should be done in collaboration with leading international experts and be supported through a programme of rapid learning from the experiences internationally. And what do they mean by international experts? Well, they mean, wankers from United States universities probably, anti-racist experts. Or even Jeff Palmer, the Jamaican God guru. Or maybe Graham Campbell if he's not still panting away after a tiresome day of channeling his inner fight against the microaggressions that are rife. The government must take action with local authorities to mitigate the risk of poor accommodation or overcrowding in some minority ethnic groups, such as migrant workers, asylum seekers and the gypsy travellers. Housing conditions have been suggested as one of the possible explanations for the disproportionate impact of the CUF on BME groups, in particular the low percentage of minority ethnic people in social housing should be looked at and addressed as set out in a recent report. Okay, well, even if that is true, that's got fuck all to do with racism, does it? The report also highlights the various housing and homeless issues facing minority ethnic groups and suggests a number of recommendations, including the need to have reliable and up-to-date data and the need to close evidence gaps. Oh, closing more gaps. Wow. fuck's sake. I see. I love this here. They also say there's a need for action in areas such as employment, skills and training, job support for young people, and support for those seeking work or at risk of long-term unemployment. Opportunities for minority ethnic youth must be targeted in progress as part of a contractual agreement where public bodies are spending on significant capital infrastructure projects or modern apprenticeship programs. Oh, we need to prioritise BIMs now. Fuck yourselves, man. Honestly. Wow. And you really think they're talking about gypsies here and European migrants? Because you have to remember they keep talking about racialisation. Therefore, okay, maybe we can take gypsies out of the equation slightly here, but when we're talking about European immigrants, we're all white, according to these people. Therefore, it stands to reason that white privilege is rife and rampant. Therefore, European immigrants do not suffer the issues in regards to apprenticeships and training programs, etc., that the blacks and the browns do. Just using their logic. They're talking about BAMEs. They're talking about blacks and browns. That's what they want. Do you think Graham Campbell's sitting there complaining about racism because of Polish people suffering? No, he's fucking not. The government should take action to set up a race equality transformational investment scheme. This fund should focus on the systemic change issues highlighted in this paper and use a participatory empowerment model where ethnic minority communities are able to direct funding to areas of public service that need to change during the upcoming recovery and remobilisation phases. Employment itself talks about the need to develop action plans with annual progressive targets for public sector employment at all levels of seniority in relation to minority ethnic groups. Workplaces must share the diversity of the communities they serve and also set a positive leadership example. These targets should support achievement of the existing commitment on fair representation for minority ethnic people in the Scottish Government and public body workforce. Okay, again, this shit about fair representation, so 4% of the population is BAME, therefore 4% of the government needs to be BAME. But as for this shit about data, you hear it all the time. Sort of similar to the gender pay gap nonsense. Same thing's applicable with race or, diversity or lack thereof. What they're trying to insinuate is that we need data put in place alongside targets. Therefore, companies can be held to account if they do not reduce the gaps. If they don't increase the diversity within their workforce, they can be held to account. The evidence, the data will be there for all to see. There was a need to respond to the current COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on minority ethnic groups, and there was a need to take forward other issues that will help address problems highlighted by the pandemic, including the need to build an accountability and oversight infrastructure in Scotland. There was also a need to take on other issues that impact on the lives of all people in Scotland and creates the shared cultural narrative. Fuck off. Just fuck off. Change the curriculum for excellence. The government should make a formal change to the school curriculum as advocated by Sir and Bemis. The government should amend the curriculum for excellence social studies benchmarks to include a specific experience and outcomes measure such as I understand Scotland's historical role in empire, colonialism and transatlantic slavery and how that history has manifested at the present, and also understand the diversity of Scottish society in the past. Oh, the rife diversity of Scottish society in the past. Oh yeah, those Picts, those Celts, some Norse up top, some Saxons here and there. So fucking diverse. Yes. What they're trying to say here is, we was cans. There's always been blacks and browns here. Now there's fucking not. There should also be the potential within the curriculum for a much wider understanding of global black history. Oh my fucking god. If the curriculum was overhauled and all we were taught about was German history or Serbian history, I would tell that teacher, I would tell that school, I would probably be making a video complaining about that, but I sure as hell would prefer that over global black history or lack thereof. It's got fuck all to do with Scotland because it's not Scottish history. Global black history is there for all to see and read and care about if you're from that part of the world. Why the fuck should our youth have to suffer this bullshit? And if they're complaining and upset because the history at present or the curriculum at present is too Scottish-centric or Eurocentric, if that's a problem, then equally I can say it's a problem to shoehorn in global black fucking history. And again, what's this got to do with the coof, by the way? The government should work with the existing group co-chaired by Sir and Glasgow City Council and community members to fund a scoping study for the establishment of a national museum dedicated to illuminating Scotland's role in empire, colonialism, slavery, migration, and the history of Scotland's erasure of that history. Or erasure of the history. You know, this narrative, they love peddling this narrative that we do not know a damn thing about our past. We don't know a thing. And what we do know is being completely whitewashed. So what we're going to do is we're going to completely overhaul the education system and educate you just how we want you to be educated. You know, we'll tell you about all the bad bits. We'll tell you all about migration. It's been rife since the day dot, and slavery and colonialism and empire, and slavery never happened anywhere else in the world apart from when whites did it to the browns. Ethnic minority people, in particular from Africa and the Caribbean communities, must be overrepresented within any such work. Oh, they must be overrepresented. Why? I don't really see what the difference would be between a panel of all white anti-racists and a couple of anti-racists from the African continent or the Caribbean. What's the difference? Oh, because one's brown and one's not. Further statutes have become a focus in the global movement and clarified for all that they mean what obfuscated reality they reflect, and ask the question of what are they saying and to whom? Statutes, sorry. The government should be bold, creative and proactive, and include young and older Afro-Caribbean and people of African descent to Scotland in any decisions, making on any future decisions on statutes and cultural artefacts. Oh my God. Oh man. And to finish up, taking this forward will involve effort and resource across the public sector. There needs to be an agreement by the government and public bodies to refresh existing commitments and action plans. It's essential for public bodies to recognise the institutional and structural racism at work, to minimise impact on minority ethnic people and communities without continuing to blame the victim. Oh God. Oh, you poor people, you're so hard done by. Oh. And they want to ensure that Scots have a full understanding of the nation's history, and in particular Scotland's role in slavery and colonisation. Whatever. Let me see, because I'm really conscious of time at this point. Building national and international reputation through facilitation of expression of voices and perspectives which would otherwise be marginalised. There was a clear narrative needed to express that this is not a zero-sum situation, diverse expressions and complement rather than displace existing cultural activities. Okay. There's actually another one here, but as I said, I'm very conscious of time, but this is about data. It's just the same sort of shit, really. As you can see here. But I'm not going to go through it because, as I said, time is of the essence and this has gone on for too long. But I kind of summed up the final point. Well, they did for me, where they go on to say here.
Schools have been given new anti-racist resources that reflect diversity in culture, identities and experiences, and the value they bring to Scotland.
I'll just do this in real time quickly before I finish up. I have done a video on some of the resources that they introduced a wee while ago. There's it here. If you wish to watch it, be my guests. Peace.